Our main man, Charles, call him enthusiastic, call him passionate, even call him polarizing. But you know what? He almost always has a well reasoned, valid point. And this was no exception. If you would never call Charles polarizing and you can't even believe I uttered that word, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. If you've been in Cardano for basically any amount of time, it is no secret to you that Charles has his haters. He does. There are people who strongly dislike Charles. He has his haters, like basically any other public figure. But it's a little exacerbated with Charles. A lot of people outside of Cardano really dislike Charles. They really hate Charles. Why do they hate Charles? Because he stands up and says, Cardano is the best. And that is something they cannot hear if they are partisans of another blockchain. If they're proponents of another blockchain, I'll call them partisans because they're basically doing battle on social media every day. If they are proponents of another blockchain, they cannot have someone who stands up and has a billion different eloquent arguments as to why Cardano is the best. That is untenable to them. They cannot lie down while someone is saying something else, some other blockchain is the best. And that is what Charles does very, very, very well. Because there are so many people outside of Cardano who don't like Charles saying the things he says, and he is passionate about it. You could tell he really believes. He really believes the foundation they've laid for Cardano is the best. It's the best. The best choices have been made in laying the groundwork for the future of blockchain technology, creating positive change in global society. I think he really does believe that. The critics, because it's difficult to attack Charles on the merits of his arguments, it's pretty difficult. The dude is very smart. I haven't heard I basically have never heard anyone say that they think Charles is not smart. A few crazy people, but I think most people would listen to Charles talk a little bit and they'd say, this guy's probably pretty smart. They may disagree with him, but they would probably respect his abilities as an orator, his intellect, his arguments. Most people I would think, would come away from talking with Charles with some amount of respect for the man's intelligence. So they tend not to attack him on his actual arguments, on the merits of his arguments. They tend to try to dismiss Cardano in other ways. And we've talked about this in the past. That's not what we're going to go into today. We're going to talk about something else. So it would be unfair to say that Charles doesn't also face some criticism from within Cardano. And I would argue that a lot of that criticism, people can disagree with the decisions that have been made inside Cardano, and there are lots of valid arguments. Lots of choices had to be made, and different choices could have been made. IOG and Charles could have easily made different choices on a number of different decisions. And there were probably multiple valid decisions. So people have valid arguments on a lot of different choices that have been made. But there are also people who seem to criticize Charles, people inside Cardano, purely because his passion for declaring that Cardano is the best, his enthusiasm for Cardano, they believe, I think, has disallowed them from being in the crypto cool kids club. We're not just another Solana. We're not just another Ethereum L2 that the Ethereum maximalists can get along with. We're not, some chain that the Bitcoin maximalists would be okay with. No, we're another chain in the top 10 saying we're the best. So we're not going to be best buddies with the ardent maximalists of Ethereum and Bitcoin. And I think Charles faces some criticism because some people in Cardano, and I don't even think it's a lot, I think it's just a minority of people in Cardano would prefer that we just get along and we don't really say we're the best. We don't really, talk so passionately about the advantages of the Cardano blockchain versus Ethereum and Bitcoin. I think this is a grave mistake. I understand some people's personality would probably be more compatible with what should we call it? A less flamboyant blockchain where we don't dare say we're the best. I wouldn't like to be in that kind of blockchain, that kind of well-mannered blockchain that never declares it's the best. What I'm saying is we should be trying to be the best. And if you're trying to be the best, you might as well just say it. Hey, we're not competing for second place here. We're trying to be the best blockchain in the entire world. And we think the decisions that have been made inside our blockchain ecosystem put us on that track, the track to be the blockchain that does the most in the future. I think you should declare yourself to be the best if you are ardently trying to be the best. You should say, hey, we're the best. If you think you've made good decisions that put you on the track to be the best, you should just go ahead and say it. I'd rather be in that kind of blockchain with a passionate leader who's not afraid to say it. I definitely want a leader who thinks our blockchain is the best. I don't want a leader who thinks our blockchain is like mediocre. I want the guy who thinks we're the best and isn't afraid to say it to the rest of the world. I understand other people's personalities might not be the same as mine. They might not make that same decision. However, we have a very great example right here of exactly the things we've been talking about. So this was a post. This was from Charles' most recent AMA. You can see Logan the lobster there. You can see the masks on the wall. You can see a bison skull. This is a classic Charles AMA. And during this AMA, Charles said something he said maybe a million times. Why do Ethereum and Bitcoin get a pass? Why do the Ethereum and Bitcoin maximalists try to say that they are commodities and everything else is a security? And Charles asked the question, hey, if you're so convinced that Cardano is so different, run the Howey test for me and explain it to me like I'm 5. Explain to me how Bitcoin with 2 or 3 pools that could be subpoenaed to complete a 51% attack because they control a majority of the hash rate. Explain to me how that's more decentralized than Cardano. And I checked right when this came out. I checked. Cardano had a MAV, a minimum attack vector of 35. We had a MAV of 35 compared to the MAV in Bitcoin of 2 or 3. So you can't make this decentralization argument about Bitcoin. If your goal is to say that Bitcoin is more decentralized than Cardano, very difficult given the facts, not subjective opinion, given the facts. What percentage, what number of actors control a majority of the validation? In Bitcoin, it's 2 or 3. In Cardano, it's about 35 right now. Those two numbers are very, very different. We have 10x the decentralization of validation that Bitcoin does. Then we move on to Ethereum. Charles makes a very good argument here. Ethereum did an ICO. Cardano didn't do an ICO in the US. If we're talking about securities and commodities definitions, we're talking about US law. We're talking about US securities and commodities laws. We're talking about the SEC and who they get to go after. Because let's face it, the SEC is pretty much the executioner right now. And while they may not be able to completely kill off their prey all the time, as in the Ripple case, they can definitely hold you up quite a while. They can distract you and postpone your development for many years. The SEC is the executioner, but they have to abide by US law. So the question when we talk about an ICO versus no ICO, it's really about things that US law applies to. As we've talked about many times on this channel, the Cardano initial distribution was a distribution of vouchers in Japan. No American buyers were involved in that whatsoever. So, of course, the next question you ask is, how then did I end up with Cardano? How did you end up with Cardano? How did everybody in Cardano today end up with Cardano? All of these people, obviously outside of Japan and many, many in the US. It's because the people who bought those vouchers, eventually ADA was airdropped to them based on their purchase of the vouchers. All of that, according to the Cardano founding entities, was done according to Japanese law. I haven't seen anyone dispute that. I haven't seen any information to the contrary. It does appear, based on what I've seen, that, you know, no one is claiming that that initial sale of ADA was done not in non-compliance with Japanese law, and all the buyers were Japanese. So that would seem to be a distribution of assets, we'll call them, that is outside of the wheelhouse of the SEC. This is a fundamentally different situation than the Ethereum ICO, which was a straight up ICO to buyers all over the place, including in the United States. Americans bought in the Ethereum ICO. It was an ICO, exactly the kind that the SEC has spent a lot of time going after crypto ecosystems for. This is exactly their bread and butter. Did you sell something that looks to us like a security? Did you sell it to Americans? Okay, unless you meet some kind of exemption or it was a registered offering, then we're going to go after you. This is what the SEC does, and that's pretty much exactly what Ethereum did. Sure, if you're an Ethereum maximalist, go ahead and make all the other types of arguments you can about why maybe for some reason you think Ether was not a security at that time. I'll let the Ethereum maximalists do all that. But what we can't say is that Ethereum's initial distribution did happen in the United States. Cardano's did not. And Charles is making this point. You can argue that decentralization is the thing, but Bitcoin can't make that argument vis-a-vis Cardano because we're more decentralized, at least in terms of validation. You can argue that the Howey test and distributions that qualify as securities distributions under the Howey test are the thing. But Ethereum can't make that argument in regard to Cardano because Cardano's distribution didn't even happen in the US. And we talked before about different arguments you could make. There were different hypothetical arguments you could make about, whether or not it could have been reasonably guessed that the Japanese buyers in that voucher sell would eventually sell into the US secondary markets. There's a lot of additional nuance there we're not going to go into in this video. But as far as the initial offering of the assets that led to people holding ADA and Ether, one of those things happened in Japan with Japanese buyers. One of them happened in the US with American buyers. And Cardano falls on the good side of that ledger, while Ethereum is not. Charles makes a very good point here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It matters, I think, to anyone unbiased, and it matters to all of us in Cardano because we understand these arguments. It doesn't matter to anybody outside of Cardano because they're not trying to argue the merits with Charles. So we'll go down here and see, of course, immediately the same account that posted this video of Charles. Okay, I won't say immediately. I don't know what the timing was, but same day at least, they then post same energy, and it's a video of Nicki Minaj. So, insane disrespect. Charles is making an argument on the merits, and what does he get? Same energy as Nicki Minaj in this video. You can watch the video to understand what she's talking about, but not the kind of comparison I think, most crypto founders would want. They wouldn't want to be compared to this video of Nicki Minaj. Nothing against her, but this energy, maybe your take would be she's just passionate and it's okay for our founder to be passionate. That's how I feel about him. Anyway, the more important response was this one from Adam Back. A lot of you know the name of Adam Back from Blockstream because Charles has speculated maybe he's Satoshi. There are certain things about Adam Back that meet what people suspect about Satoshi based on his writings and other things. But Adam Back said this: Charles, it's very simple. Bitcoin didn't do an ICO. Most people thought it had no value. It was mined from zero. It is decentralized. There's no CEO, no ICO, war-chested foundation, no incorporation, etc. So Cardano, ETH, etc. clearly pass Howey. Bitcoin is a commodity and does not. And when he says they pass Howey, he's saying they meet the requirements set out in the Howey case to establish that those things are a security. So what he's saying, of course, is it's the ICO. The ICO's the most important thing. And then he just says it is decentralized. Oh yeah, Adam? What about what about the 2 or 3 mining pools that control a majority of the hash rate? How is that decentralized compared to a Cardano? And of course, he's going to argue, yeah, but if those 2 or 3 entities tried to, perform a 51% attack, or even if they were subpoenaed, even if there was some kind of judicial order applied to them that would result in something that people might feel is a 51% attack, then everybody delegating to those pools, I'll use the delegation term because it's going to be more familiar to us in proof of stake, but basically all the miners who are pooling their hash rate, their hash power in those pools would point their hash rate to another pool. That's always the argument. But the fact stands. You've got 2 or 3 entities, in this case, mining pools, controlling a majority of the hash rate. That's not decentralized, Adam. I'm sorry, it's not. You can make all kinds of weird arguments about what would happen if those pools try to do anything, but it's currently not decentralized. If you had 35 different pools making a majority of the hash rate, that would be decentralized, but then you'd call yourself Cardano. And you notice here, the maximalists also hate each other. He's throwing Ether in there with Cardano. When you talk to the Ethereum guys, the Ethereum maximalists, they might also point out the lack of decentralization among the mining pools that control a majority of the hash rate of Bitcoin. But of course, they are not going to focus on the ICO issue because they did an ICO. They're going to point to so many other things. The goalposts are always moving. Every maximalist in every community is going to say, we're not a security for this reason. And it's always going to be a different thing. The Bitcoin guys are going to say, it's because we didn't do an ICO, regardless of the fact there's no decentralization. The Ethereum guys are going to say, it's because everything's run by the foundation and we have multiple clients, multiple clients are used in the ecosystem, and all these different entities have built on top of our blockchain, all those kinds of metrics, but they all have these sort of like different goalposts to achieve we're not a security. And of course, they're all those are all going to vindicate them and incriminate everybody else. So Charles, what I love about Charles, and here's part of why I like that he is so passionate, is he's not just going to leave this alone. Charles is going to come back and passionately argue. He's not going to just lie down and take the criticism. He says there was no Cardano ICO. There was an airdrop onto a distribution, and then thousands of people who never met each other traded ADA on exchanges and used Cardano for their projects. Here he's referring to the Japanese voucher sell. A voucher sell of a different asset outside of the United States, priced in yen, settled in Bitcoin, explained in Japanese to Japanese citizens, and without a single U.S. participant, does not constitute an ICO of ADA. And I think, maybe another way to say that would be it does not constitute an ICO of ADA under US law. And it was also compliant with Japanese law, according to, the 3 entities involved. So, Charles has got a good point. You know what I mean? It's illegal to consume certain substances in the United States. But if you do it in Amsterdam, you're not really violating US law. There are other things that are illegal to do in the United States. You can do them elsewhere. This is what happened with Cardano. But Adam Back ain't trying to come onto X and get schooled by Charles. That was not his plan. He was supposed to do the schooling around here. He's not supposed to get schooled by Charles. So he says, I'm sure you have legal advice to not say certain things, so are at a slight disadvantage in discussing. I love it when people do this, like pretending like he's just concerned about Charles's disadvantage in their discourse, while at the same time making this underhanded suggestion that that there are certain things Charles is hiding. I'm sure you have legal advice to not say certain things. And then he goes on to list a few things, but an airdrop and a pre-mine and some market making. So if we look at these each individually, but an airdrop. So he's just relabeling exactly what Charles described. There was a voucher sell, and then they got ADA because they held the vouchers. I'm guessing this was just to comply with Japanese law. I'm guessing there was some advantage, some compliance advantage to selling them vouchers and then airdropping the ADA, or maybe they just weren't ready to. Maybe they just weren't ready to mint all the ADA. Maybe they weren't ready to actually create the coins yet, and they needed the assets to pay for the work that was left to be done before they could actually mint the ADA. There's a lot of reasons for that, but he's pretty much just relabeling, what was probably either a practical consideration or a compliance, something for compliance with Japanese law as an airdrop. And there have been a ton of airdrops in crypto. He says an airdrop and a pre-mine. So it's not really a pre-mine because we're proof of stake. So there's no mining at all. It's not really a pre-mine, it's just a pre-mint, if you will. But everybody knows this. The Cardano Foundation has had a web page. It's like Cardano Foundation Genesis or something like that. I even saw someone, someone even posted a link to it in this conversation. I've actually shown it on this channel multiple times. But the Cardano Foundation has a web page that describes all the parameters of the Japanese cell. They even have the exact nation state identity of all the buyers. None of them were American. They show ton of them were from Japan and a few from a bunch of other countries around Asia, but none of them were Americans. And everybody's known about that since the start. Everybody's known since the start that IOHK, Emergo, and the foundation all they all minted some ADA and gave it to themselves. I'm glad they did. I wouldn't have wanted them to just create Cardano and walk away. I'm glad they gave themselves an incentive to stick around Cardano. That's definitely been to the benefit of all of us. And he says, last thing, and some market making. So market making, I seem to recall in Bitcoin, there was definitely some liquidity in those markets. I was buying Bitcoin before Cardano was even a glimmer in Charles's eye. And there was definitely liquidity in those markets. You could argue some of those markets were probably, organic. There were things like local Bitcoins, where you just like directly trade with somebody you connected with on a website. But by the time I was buying Bitcoin, there were already markets, and seemed like somebody was doing some market making in those markets, those Bitcoin markets, because there was definitely liquidity in those markets, and they kicked those off somehow. It didn't seem like it was all organic. So it seemed like somebody was doing some market making in Bitcoin. Then he says, those things are still an ICO. And I love how he doesn't like cite any case law or any interpretations of case law or any statutes or any regulations. He's just like, oh, your ICO didn't even happen in the US. Okay, I'm going to move the goalposts. Here's my new definition for an ICO. Even though he doesn't address at all the fact that it didn't even happen in the US and there were no American buyers. He's still pretending like US law is somehow global law. Hey, there's one global definition of an ICO, even though there isn't even a US definition, but he's saying there's one global definition and it's the US definition. And by the way, I'm going to go ahead and make that up right now. Then he says, plus obvious management team reliance for expectation of profit. So this is an interesting one because he's actually citing a prong of Howey here. An expectation of profit in reliance on the efforts of someone. and that someone needs to be sort of a promoter of the asset that you're trying to accuse of being a security. So obvious management team reliance for expectation of profit. Unfortunately, that's not how Howie works. You have to fulfill all the prongs of Howie. You can't just fulfill one prong of Howie. You've got to fulfill all the prongs of Howie. Did people buy ADA hoping that IOHK and Emergo and the foundation would stick around and build stuff? They certainly did. They certainly hoped that IOHK would stick around and build stuff. But that's just one prong of Howie, and you have to fulfill all the prongs of Howie. But more importantly, Howie is U.S. case law, and the Cardano distribution didn't even happen in the U.S. Here, Adam Back, he pretends like he's concerned about Charles's disadvantage in their discussion, but he ignores the most important point of Charles's entire post: the fact that it happened in Japan. The one thing he doesn't address. An airdrop is not an. So Charles comes back, of course, and this is what I love about having a passionate leader of our blockchain ecosystem. Charles is going to come back. He's not going to take this line down. He says, an airdrop is not an ICO. Even the SEC has left this ambiguous. True, in my opinion. Ask the SEC what the status of EOS is after their settlement with Block One. Yes, that case. So EOS did the gigantic ICO. What was it, like $4 billion? And Block One settled with the SEC over EOS. There was no public offering of ADA from a centralized source. It was an offering by the foundation. I believe the way it's described on that Genesis page of the Cardano Foundation, the way it's described on that webpage is that it was an offering from the foundation. There was one by Ethereum for Ether, and they apparently are a security, so that can't even be the standard. Yeah. I mean, if you talk to, obviously Adam Back is going to throw Ethereum under the bus any chance he gets. Also, they're going to throw everybody under the bus aside from Bitcoin. But it can't simultaneously be the case that Ethereum, that the standard of are you a security for Ethereum is decentralization, even though we're also more decentralized than Ethereum. It can't be the case that the standard is decentralization for Ethereum and did you do an ICO for Bitcoin? The standards aren't different for different assets. The context can be different. The way the standard is applied, can be slightly different given the context, those kinds of things. But the standard is the same standard. We have definitions for things in US law, and there's a definition for securities. It's kind of ambiguous. It's pretty hazy. The Howey test is certainly not perfect, but there's one standard. He says, I'm done with the Bitcoin community calling everyone who isn't Bitcoin scammers. I'm done with Team Orange lobbying the US government to criminalize everything but Bitcoin. I'm done with the sad arguments that mining somehow is different when Satoshi was the sole miner for months with Bitcoin and had absolute power over the network. All true. He stayed anonymous by his own admission because of legal ambiguity. I'm sorry, running a network yourself for a year, getting 10% of the supply, and then selling them isn't somehow morally superior to proof of stake. The public supply of ADA was distributed by tens of thousands of Japanese people trading on the secondary market after the network launched. And here, I believe, is where it runs dry. I believe, I could be wrong, but I don't believe we have another. We got a lot of other people trying to chime in, but I don't believe we have another response from Adam Back, because Charles pretty much calls him out on his goalpost movement. He says, Adam Back at first says basically ICOs are the thing. And then Charles says, we didn't do an ICO. It all happened in Japan in compliance with Japanese law. And then he says, oh, when I say ICO, I mean my definition of an ICO, and it's these things. And then Charles says, even by your definition, or actually he says, your definition is not the definition of an ICO. And then he goes to cite an example, and we don't hear anything from Adam Back. So I like that Adam Back at least tried to address the merits of the argument. He at least tried to address the merits, even if he wasn't very successful. But this is why people see examples like this, and this is why they don't go after Cardano or Charles on the merits. Even Adam Back, who, let's face it, is probably some kind of intellectual hero to some portion of the Bitcoin community. Some portion of the Bitcoin community is going to look up to him. He goes in to do battle with the evil founder of Cardano, Charles Hoskinson, and even Adam Back loses because Cardano is not fighting these battles with propaganda. We're fighting them with facts. And I'm glad we've got a leader of our blockchain ecosystem who's very passionate about those facts. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.